Good morning, everybody. Or afternoon, I guess. Almost, not quite. Feels like morning still. Welcome back to the 29th annual Ozark Mountain UFO Conference. 29 years, can you believe that? Isn't it fantastic? I, for one, are very, very thankful that Julia and Dolores's family, I guess, is the best way that you guys are keeping this tradition going. It's just fantastic. So I'm very thankful that you guys are doing that. Now, before we start with our first speaker, I want to bring Jerry Blackburn up. Jerry Blackburn is the keeper of Lou Farrish's trust, and he's going to come up and give away the Lou Farrish Outstanding Achievement in Ufology Award for this year. Jerry?
Good morning, and thanks to Julia for providing a little bit of time for this. This is an annual award given by the Lou Farrish Trust to honor, give recognition and appreciation to somebody who deserves extra credit, extra recognition for their work in ufology. In just a moment, I will tell you who that is and a little about them. But first, probably a lot of you have never had a chance to meet Lou Farrish, and I'd like to take a second to tell you a little about him. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you knew Lou Farrish or attended one of the 20 or so conferences? Okay, probably half of you. He was one of the most interesting people I've ever known. He was very smart, funny, had an encyclopedic memory, especially for UFO case details. But he was very down to earth. What you saw was what you got. He directed the UFO conference here for about 20 years. He was also the editor and co-editor of the UFO News Clipping Service, which back before the internet was about the best source of credible reports of UFOs from around the world. My association with Lou goes back to an abduction regression case in I think it was about 1976. We were both involved in that investigation in Little Rock, and got to know him and became good friends. And over the years, worked with him on several projects. I provided computer support for the conference for several years. We had a UFO discussion group in Little Rock that at times had as many as 90 members. I helped co-facilitate that. Excuse me. Toward the end, when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, I helped him manage his hospice care and final arrangements. He asked that his estate be left to a trust to be used for UFO research and education. There are 4 parts to the trust. One was for mini grants of up to $5,000, and we have awarded 31 of those. We are going to be winding down the trust in the next 30 days. Part was for graduate fellowships. We never had any takers on that. Excuse me. Part of it was for travel for international speakers like Eric von Däniken at this conference. And part of it was for an annual award, which we're about to present. This year's recipient will be in very good company, as you can see. Linda Moulton Howe, Richard Doan, and Peter Davenport. Linda or Richard, are you out in the audience? I don't see them. This year's recipient had, like Lou Farrish, a lifelong interest in UFOs. Dedicated most of his adult life to UFO research and education. He is a leading expert on triangular UFOs, and he's the next speaker, the first speaker at this conference. Our award goes to David Marler. I hate to spring this on David. It's kind of unfair to do this right before somebody's going to give a talk. David, would you come on up here? Whoa, congratulations. I want to tell them a little bit more about you before I give you the award.
Sure.
David has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Southern Illinois University. He's a certified hypnotherapist, registered polysomnographic technician. Did I pronounce that right?
You actually did. No.
It's a tongue twister. Trained in diagnosing and treating sleep disorder, works for an international medical company, and lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There are 3 reasons that we felt that he deserves this. These awards are based, by the way, on a poll of what I call the Friends of Lou mailing list. About 60 people who knew Lou well. Many of them sent him cards when he was in hospice care. Some of them visited him, but people who knew him well, knew his values and his interests. David's research is exemplary, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. His efforts to educate the public about UFOs, and he has an amazing personal library we'll talk about. He has become the leading researcher of triangular UFOs in the country, maybe in the world, known for his meticulous, objective, fact-based, insightful research and writing. He's a public lecturer and frequent speaker at conferences like this one. He's contributed to several documentaries on the Learning Channel, History Channel, Discovery Channel, and Smithsonian Channel, plus independent productions. His UFO library is one of the most unique reasons for this award. He's created one of the largest personal UFO libraries in this country and maybe in the world, I don't know. But it's freely available to UFO researchers. In fact, he was the person that Lou Farrish donated his own extensive UFO library to when he died. It took about two U-Haul trailers, U-Haul trucks to, might have taken 2 UFOs to move his library to where David at that time lived in St. Louis. But David realizes that many UFO researchers, when they approach the end of their life, don't know what to do with their research papers. They may have file cabinets full of case studies, and if their family doesn't understand or maybe even like UFOs, there's a risk of those years of research winding up in the landfill. So David is openly inviting people in a situation like that to, like Lou did, to donate their papers to his library. And he has made arrangements with the University of New Mexico to, upon his own death, house that library collection. So for all these reasons, it's my pleasure to in recognition of and appreciation of all you've done and are doing, David, try not to break this, the 2016 Lucius O. Farrish Award for Excellence in UFO-Related Research and Education. Congratulations.
Thank you, Jerry.
He's going to get some pictures for us. Okay, I'll come down there in a minute. There's also a $1,000 check that goes with this. And again, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Forrest.
Jerry stole my intro for David. I don't know what else to say. Actually, he was kind enough to present all the technical stuff about David, his background. So I'm going to give you a little bit more of an extemporaneous introduction, because David has been a dear friend of mine since 1989, 1990. In his bio, he talks about getting involved in UFO research and being a MUFON field investigator trainee. And usually that lasts about 10 minutes, by the way. If you've ever joined MUFON, you're a field investigator trainee until you go do anything, and then you're a full field investigator. Well, anyway, that happened in my living room. David and his dad came over to my house, and they had heard about the UFO meetings that we were having for Illinois MUFON at the time, and I signed him up. And then I've been very privileged to work with him a lot through the 90s and until he moved away, I guess. And then I moved away too. But we worked together a lot, and very, very privileged to work with a field investigator like David. I can't stress this enough, because a lot of times in this field we tend to spiral off into speculation. And we love doing that. Let's not be wrong about that. But sometimes we have trouble coming back from that highly speculative place and remembering that we're trying to ground ourselves in science. That's the best way to convince people to examine this phenomenon, is you need to show some facts and then postulate what the different possibilities are. So David is one of these researchers that keeps us honest, okay? We need more researchers like David in the field of ufology so that we don't go too far astray. We stay focused on the facts. He is the most meticulous, detailed, and accurate field investigator and researcher that I have ever worked with, period. If he tells you something, you can assure yourself that it has been carefully researched and that it is as fact-based as you can possibly get. He does not leap to conclusions. He is a brilliant researcher, obviously. He just got the award for that. It speaks for itself. It deserves every bit of it. So, David Marler.
Wow. I'm in the back of the room watching everyone file in, and I'm trying to think to myself, I want to get my thoughts straight. I want to make sure I'm mentally prepared for this presentation, and then they slap this on me. And just so you know, they don't tell me this ahead of time. I just found out along with yourself. I'm sitting back there thinking, I wonder who's going to win the award this year. So you're going to have to bear with me. I'm usually much more composed, but I'm a little bit, taken aback by this. I want to thank Jerry, obviously, and Forrest as well. Again, a dear friend of mine. For that wonderful introduction. No pressure, Dave. It's like now you have to not only kick off the conference, but now we've set the bar pretty high in that regard. So bear with me here while we pull this up. There we go. So, wow, like I said, I had a completely prepared introductory statement. Now I'm kind of taken by surprise. We have a lot of information to cover today. For those of you that know me, either from documentaries or from my research or lectures in the past, I've always focused on the triangular UFO mystery, but as Forrest has alluded to, I've done other investigations, other research in other areas, have an extensive UFO library, and am not just only interested in the triangular UFO mystery. That's just one aspect. But a couple of things I'd like to note up front before we begin. One of the reasons I'm up here lecturing on this particular case or this particular subject matter today, the title is Flying Saucer Invasion of 1950, Farmington, New Mexico and Beyond. We're going to talk about the Farmington, New Mexico case from March 1950. And historically, and it was interesting, last night at the dinner, some of us were talking and some in the lobby this morning. I'm amazed at how many people, A, know about the case, and B, don't know about the case. It's about 50-50. I did a lecture recently in Albuquerque, and about 80% of the audience I polled had never heard of this case, which hopefully you'll be like me at the end of this presentation. I'm amazed by that, because this is one of the most significant UFO cases to date, and yet it hasn't been thoroughly investigated to the depth that I feel it needs to be. We're going to cover a lot of material. We're going to talk about archival newspaper reports, military reports. You're going to hear interviews with eyewitnesses. We have a special treat. I actually have a living eyewitness from 1950 that will be getting up. Originally, I was just going to share a recorded interview segment, but he was nice enough to be here today, and he's going to come up later and tell you in his own words, rather than hearing it from a UFO researcher, what he witnessed in March of 1950. Before we begin, though, as I mentioned, one of the things I wanted to mention is the fact that this gentleman right here, Mr. Mike Driscoll, and Mike, I know you're in the audience, but where are you sitting? Can you raise your hand? You're over there. This is the man, this is the reason why we're having this lecture today. This is Mike and I back in roughly 2004, 2005, I think, time frame, Mike. And as it was alluded to in the introduction, I've done a lot of education, public education. I was Illinois State Director here at the time, and Mike called me one day and said, my grandson's in middle school, and they're reading a book in critical reading skills on UFOs, and he mentioned that I investigate UFOs for MUFON, and they want me to come and do a school lecture. He goes, I need backup. And one teacher from one school told another teacher at the neighboring school that were teaching the same curriculum, and Mike and I did a series of extensive UFO lectures to middle school kids, and it was great. As I like to say, middle school is a great audience because by the time they get to high school, they think they already know everything. So you can't really have a good discussion. This is just one of the many lectures we did, but the reason I bring this up before we dive into the material, for years, both here at the conference over the years, Mike, right, and as well as our MUFON meetings, we would always have a discussion. We would reference a particular case or a particular individual. And inevitably, Mike would always come back and say, I don't care what you say, Dave. Nothing beats that Farmington, New Mexico case from 1950. And every time he would bring that up, well, I moved to New Mexico 4 years ago, and after I had written my book on triangular UFOs, I decided I would go ahead. I'm going up to Farmington on business all the time. I figured I would reach out, start talking to some of the witnesses, and slowly started putting this material together. There's been some discussion on the case over the years, but I've been able to uncover new data, actually old new data, if I can use that terminology, which we're going to look at. And again, like I said, you'll hear from the eyewitnesses as well in this particular case. But we're going to dive into it, and I conveyed, I mentioned, or I should say warned to some of you this morning downstairs that there's going to be a lot of information I'm going to throw at you. So in the interest of keeping on track, I'm going to move quickly. We're going to go through it. But myself and the witness that you'll hear from later will actually be here all weekend. So if you have questions, please feel free to approach me. So with that being said, this lecture's for you, Mike. So, before we dive in, let's look at a little bit of history. April 14th, 1561, in the early morning hours, this spectacle played out over Nuremberg, Germany. And witnesses in the city describe orbs, balls, cylinders, cigar-shaped objects, a myriad of objects dancing about, playing in the sky, having a tussle or a battle, as it was often mentioned. And this played out in the skies over Nuremberg, Germany, broad daylight. Reason I bring this up, remember this as we start talking about Farmington, because what we're going to do is actually jump ahead 389 years from Nuremberg. So just keep that in mind. So when I talk about UFOs over Farmington, New Mexico, this is probably what you're used to seeing if you've Googled this or if you're familiar with this case. Huge saucer armada jolts Farmington from the Farmington Daily Times. Now, if you do a Google search, most often, I'd say 95% of the time, you're going to find reference to this particular newspaper article. They quote it ad infinitum, ad nauseum. But there's other newspaper articles out there, other sets of data. How about that for a headline? Do you think you'd see that in today's newspapers? Spaceships cause sensation. Another one, Farmington invaded by saucer squadron. I mean, that's just amazing in this day and age to look back at some of those headlines. And a few individuals, friends of mine, said, well, why are you calling it the flying saucer invasion? Their words, not mine. That was what they were terming it back then. So these are just some of the headlines at the time chronicling that case. But I think this is one of the most misrepresented cases and also underrated cases in ufology. The fact of the matter is, in speaking with many of you, you had never heard of it before. There were numerous eyewitnesses in Farmington, New Mexico alone, and we're going to actually expand beyond the confines of Farmington, look at New Mexico, look at the Southwest, even extending down into Mexico to see what was going on in March 1950. Estimated 85% of the population of 61 people, according to the Hobbs New Mexico Daily News. So we're looking at roughly 5,000 plus witnesses to this event. That was the estimate. The objects themselves, over a 3-day period, we're looking at hundreds of objects in broad daylight. I always like to say, as a UFO investigator, it don't get better than this. we have one or two witnesses that maybe see one or two objects. We're talking thousands of witnesses to hundreds of objects over a 3-day period. And there's been a lot of miscommunication with regard to the case. Quite often they'll only cite the main day, which we'll discuss, Friday, March 17th. But in fact, there were 2 previous days of sightings building up to the climax, if you will. Again, detailed documentation in the newspapers that we're going to review. Possible photographic evidence, and this is something that I've personally been chasing, and I'll share that information with you today. And again, minimal research has been conducted, especially when you see the new material that I'll be presenting today that has actually been out there. It just hasn't been collated and analyzed. So there have been rare references to the case. Historically, Frank Scully in his 1950 book, Behind the Flying Saucers, actually referenced this case in some detail. He quoted a number of New Mexico newspapers as well as Texas newspapers and others across the country. But setting the stage, let's take ourselves back. We're looking, 5 years at the end of World War II, after the end of World War II. Harry S. Truman was president. And one of the major developments at the time was the development of the hydrogen bomb, which, ironically enough, was in New Mexico at Los Alamos. A lot of work being done at Los Alamos. Not too far from stone's throw or by air from Farmington, New Mexico. So setting the stage, here's New Mexico. We have Albuquerque here. Some of you have been to Roswell, I think. So Roswell's down here. We're actually looking up here in the Four Corners region of Farmington. And like I said, I've been living there for 4 years now. Just love the terrain, love exploring the state. It's an absolutely beautiful state, and I'm not getting paid by the New Mexico Bureau of Tourism to say that. But it truly is a beautiful state for those of you that have been there. But this was 3 years after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier, and 3 years after the Roswell incident. And this was also during the period known as Project Grudge, during the Air Force investigation, which was often referred to as the Dark Ages. There were very skeptical powers that be within the Air Force and military channels that were trying to just downplay the UFO subject altogether. So just something to keep in mind. Now, before we talk about the Farmington incident and the objects that were seen over that 3-day period, something we need to take into account, because I think when we look at cases, when we look at events like this, we have to establish some context. What else was going on at the time? Since late 1948, November 1948 to be specific, green fireballs, these luminescent meteor-like objects, and I say that very carefully, were sighted over the Southwest, specifically New Mexico. And this gentleman, Dr. Lincoln La Paz from the University of New Mexico, was tasked by the Air Force. He was under contract to help them investigate this phenomenon. The frequency of the reports were unusual, much more severe that year, that period, or those years, than any year before or after. And the luminosity was very unusual. So there were anomalous characteristics that even Dr. Lincoln La Paz questioned. He didn't feel that these were meteors, but he was actively investigating that for the Air Force. And again, the sightings continued till 1951. And again, just to give some context, started November 48, but really in 49, 50, 51, the green fireballs were active over the terrain of New Mexico. In 1950 is the year we're going to be looking at, specifically March. So just keep in mind that all of this was going on in addition to what we're going to be talking about today. So again, here's Farmington, New Mexico. We have the Four Corners region right up here. And keep in mind, 3 consecutive days: Wednesday, March 15th, Thursday, March 16th, Friday, March 17th. I mean, how often do we have that? It's very rare we have a flap that's localized. And again, broad daylight. We're talking objects, not lights in the sky. I think that's important to point out. Now, before the events actually occurred, in going through the newspaper archives, both online and at University of New Mexico, we had reports pouring in. This is rather interesting. We have Roswell up here, but way far south from Roswell is this little area called Eunice, New Mexico, right on the Texas border. And in this particular instance, you can actually see here that a husband and wife were driving when they saw suddenly appear in the sky a red revolving disc. And this object was glowing red, moving very slowly, tracking to the east. And then over Eunice, it suddenly made an acute right angle turn, accelerated, and disappeared to the north. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, that's interesting. What I want you to take away from that is the fact that this is a red, glowing UFO. Because as you're going to find as we progress through these other reports, this is a common denominator, specifically over Farmington, but other parts of New Mexico as well. So just remember this red object. And again, keeping in mind 2 days before Farmington. So, another report, this was from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Flying saucers aren't saucers, they're globes with rows of windows. And when I read this report, this was a teenager that reported seeing these objects over the mountains near Santa Fe. And in this particular case, I thought back to this Fate magazine image from their summer 1948 issue. I'd say that's a globe with rows of windows, wouldn't you? But isn't that interesting that was on Tuesday, March 14th that occurred? So maybe a prelude of things to come. Well, and then on Saturday, March 18th, the big newspaper article ran. Many of you are familiar with this, but just bear with me for those that have read this. I just want to touch on some of the salient points as we go into discussing this. So, as one of my colleagues back in New Mexico likes to point out, one of the great typos in UFO history, craft seen by hundreds. So, speed estimated at 1,000 miles an hour, altitude estimated 20,000 feet. Now, as we're going to find out, apparently there were varying flights of UFOs moving in different directions at varying altitudes. In this particular case, they were referencing the higher altitude sightings. But wait till you see the detail that we have from the eyewitnesses as we get into more detail. But again, for some researchers that have only alluded to this as only occurring on one day, like the government explanation, which we will hopefully tear to shreds by the end of this presentation, you see here, very first words, for the third consecutive day, flying saucers have been reported over Farmington. And it states that their arrival happened around 11 or 12 noon. So just skipping through, I just want to hit some of the salient points here. It says fully half of this town's population is still certain that they saw spaceships or some strange aircraft, hundreds of them zooming through the skies yesterday, again referencing the third day, Friday. Estimates of the number ran between several to more than 500. Now, even if we take a conservative estimate, let's say it's 100 UFOs. I mean, how many UFOs do you have to make it a really good case? One good UFO, I think, is interesting enough. I would love to see one UFO. But whatever they were, they caused a major sensation, and it references that they're only 110 air miles from Los Alamos. The object appeared to play a tag high in the air, at times streaking away at almost unbelievable speeds. Very reminiscent of other reports we have. And then one witness talks about triangulating the objects. It says that it was twice the size of a B-29. Farmington citizens stood in the streets yesterday watching the first reported mass flying saucers ever sighted. Traffic was slowed to avoid hitting sky gazers. So you kind of get an idea or sense of the drama that was playing out. I will say, though, in speaking to some of the witnesses, no one panicked. There was really not a level of panic, but fascination. To the point where people are almost getting hit in the street because they weren't watching the cars, they were watching the UFOs. Now here, remember what we talked about Eunice, a red leader. Scores described the objects as silvery discs. A number agreed they saw one that was red in color, bigger and faster, and apparently the leader. You'll often hear it referred to in these narratives that we'll look at and examine as the red leader. They would often call it that. And it goes on to state individuals and their accounts. Clayton Boddy, who we will actually hear from, I have a recording from 1969 where you'll hear the description in his own words, actually stated, moments later there appeared to be about 500 of them. He could not estimate size or speed, but they appeared to be about 15,000 feet high. Goes on to give corroborative testimony to that. Also states that they were flying individually and in large formations. So a lot of activity going on. And again, it states that around 11 o'clock or so on the 17th, they saw these objects, and then a large-scale sighting occurred at 3 p.m. What we're going to find is there were multiple waves flying over at differing times from different directions. And again, we'll see how this plays into the narrative put forth by the military and the government at that time. Goes on to state that many of these individuals, like this B-29 tail gunner, many of these witnesses were pilots or former Air Force veterans. So they're familiar with aircraft, they're familiar with maneuverability. And this individual states the very maneuvering of the things could not be that of modern aircraft. And then we have additional testimony. Now, remember Nuremberg that we referred to about them playing a game of cat and mouse and tussling with one another? This witness stated they appeared to be coming at each other head on, and then at the last second, one would veer at right angles upward, the other at right angles downward. And then it talks about them kind of having a tussle or playing around. And then we have other witnesses describing these objects as looking like a dinner plate, which we'll allude to a little bit later. Then it also says they flew sideways, on edge, and at every conceivable angle. And this witness said that's what made us easy to determine that it was saucer shaped, because they were seeing it from different angles as the objects maneuvered in the sky. So continues on. It basically gives a timeline based on the eyewitness testimony documented in this newspaper article. Roughly a dozen witnesses are mentioned by name in the article. In the additional material that I've uncovered that we'll discuss momentarily, I found about an additional dozen witnesses mentioned by name with detailed testimony that either corroborates or adds to what was being discussed here in the newspaper. So, of all the individuals mentioned in the newspaper article from that time period, I was only able to find one individual to date that is actually still alive. And again, I travel up on Farmington on business on a regular basis and reached out to this individual. And in this particular case, he observed the UFOs on the first day. And we don't have much witness testimony from the very first day. This was Wednesday, March 15th, roughly between 11 a.m. and 12 noon. Now, he couldn't speak to the individual shape or color of the object so much as the formations and maneuverability, as you're going to hear. We're going to hear a segment of an interview I did with him. He stated officials did speak to him afterwards. He didn't know if they were military, government, or what have you, but he states on more than one occasion he was approached over time and questioned about the event. The one thing I like to point out, though, because again, as Forrest alluded to in the introduction, I try to be very meticulous in getting the facts straight, setting the record straight. I've read and heard some accounts where they talk about government officials sweeping in immediately after the event and swearing all the people to secrecy, threatening their lives, et cetera, et cetera. The witnesses and the notes of the interviews and investigations conducted in the 60s, there was no mention of intimidation or anything of that nature. Not to say it didn't occur, but in the ones that I actually spoke with or the interviews and interview notes that I read, there was no indication of that. And in fact, you'll hear this individual, Mr. Marlow Webb, who is again the last surviving witness, mentioned in the newspaper. He described the fact that they came in, asked a few questions. At one point, he kind of laughed because I was interrogating him. I think it went beyond an interview at one point. I was basically interrogating him because there was so much data, so much detail. We don't often get that in a UFO case. And at one point, he said, yeah, he goes, as a matter of fact, he goes, they really didn't ask me that many questions. He goes, nothing to the extent you're asking me. So at that point, I felt like I needed to back down just a little bit. I'm like, okay, calm down, Dave. You'll get the information. So real quick, it was very nice. Not only did I get testimony from some of these witnesses, but they provided these vintage photos, which I think allows us to kind of set temporal context for this. This was the Perry Smoke Chevrolet garage as it looked in 1950. Mr. Webb worked in the parts department just inside this door, and you can see the gas pumps here. He noticed when he was inside that there were people congregating, most of whom he knew because at that time Farmington was a very small town, and they're all pointing up, looking like this. And so his curiosity was piqued. He walks out to the gas pumps, and he looked over the building, and he said the UFOs reportedly flew east to west, this trajectory, until they disappeared behind the trees. And we'll address the flight directions in a minute, because one of the things that's never been done is taking the reports and then correlating that with historical meteorological data. Okay, if these are leaves or something blowing in the wind, then it should be blowing with the wind, not counter to the wind, right? Logical assumption or a logical progression of thought, I thought. So let's listen to what Mr. Marlow Webb says. Again, he'll reference being interviewed, but also I want you to hear the description of the objects. And I must say, he states to this date, I don't know what I saw. One of the things I'd like to mention, though, he's 91 years old. Still sharp as a tack. I was talking with Race Hobbs, and I told him, I said, this guy's 91, but I wish I could be that sharp in clarity of mind when I get to be his age. But he's a very successful business owner in Farmington, and he historically was a private pilot. At that time, he was a private pilot, and he was also a Navy pilot in World War II. So, you know, someone that actually knows how to identify aircraft, view aircraft. So with that being said, let's see if we can go ahead and play. And let me see here. For some reason, I'm not seeing that. Bear with me 1 second. Here we go.
But these things were a cluster. I don't know whether they were 6, 8, 10, 12, a group. And they stayed pretty much in formation. And they go and dart. And when I said saucer plate, I don't mean it was a saucer plate. Right. That's what it really related to from the ground, because we see airplanes up there. We know they're huge, but they are mini up there, 6 inches. I don't know how high it was. I don't know how big it was. Relatively, at that point up there, it looked maybe a saucer. A dinner plate, a saucer, you know, it wasn't big. I don't remember seeing them as individuals as much as I did the formations. I don't remember whether they were just scattered, an exact formation. I know they were all together.
Okay.
When they made course changes abruptly, they pretty much stayed in those formations.
Okay.
They didn't scatter.
Okay.
So that
That's a good
eliminated to me leaves blowing, because we had them blowing all over, and they were very haphazard leaves were. And so I was familiar with that. So something was holding them together.
Could you discern color?
No, at that height, can you just tell it's a change from the background. That's the formation thing, a change of direction, and then all staying in it is what I was more impressed with than the shape of the object.
And I know some accounts in the newspaper said that at times there may have been up to 500 in the air.
See, that was later, the second, third day, and that's it. Just
ballpark. What do you think? I know you said they were like in clusters. Could you give just a ballpark?
Oh, I'd say under 15, 20 in this one cluster.
Where you were standing, what direction were they coming from, and what direction were they going? Do you recall?
As I remember, I was looking to the northwest.
Okay.
Big trees, and they were flying, or I lost the vision. As they were flying east to west. I clearly remember.
East to west.
Because I lost vision of them, or maybe it was approaching losing visions. One reason I went back in. And they're coming across, and here and they were approaching, going out of my vision sight.
Okay.
So I turned around, went inside.
So that would have been from your right to left then, that trajectory?
From my right to left.
Okay, right to left, okay.
I was looking to the northwest, and they were coming from the east to west.
Okay.
At what angle, I don't know. Generally, they were moving around.
Okay.
Now, why they would be doing that over Farmington? They weren't over Farmington, they were north of us.
North of Farmington.
A little bit.
Okay. And the article, as you'll read, I think it stated that no one noticed any noise.
There was no noise.
Yeah, no noise. Okay. Did you see any contrails that you can recall or anything like that?
No.
Okay. You were saying that there were officials that had come in after the event?
Yes, and I don't remember that they weren't FBI. They were, it was one of the departments of justice. I don't know. I believe there was probably one from the military. I don't think they were FBI.
Okay. And did you say military as well?
These were plainclothes men.
Okay. No, that's interesting. But there were did you say 2 or 3 different groups?
At least 2, and I remember 2 specific, but it seems like a third, but I'm not positive of that.
And what was
that was later, maybe. Yeah. It seems like it was a year or so later they came around.
Okay. The initial group, though, how soon were they on the scene after the event? Do you recall, roughly, just ballpark?
Oh, it was probably weeks. It wasn't days.
They weren't like here the next day.
Oh, no, no.
But at the end of the day, there was something in the sky.
Oh, I saw something up there. I saw a change of formation.
Yep.
And they held the formations pretty. I won't say they held the same position in, because
it's probably safe to say that whatever these things were, they seemed to demonstrate intelligent maneuvering.
Yes, to me it did. It was my conclusion at the time. That's all.
They were under intelligent control.
I thought they were.
I think it's interesting that we can actually hear the voices, not just read the transcripts, but actually hear from the individuals, see that there are still some around, and we'll be talking about another witness here shortly. But I want to thank Mr. Webb for his time. I've actually interviewed him several times, and it was interesting because he told me the first interview, and as you do successive interviews, you start to develop a rapport with the witnesses. At first he was somewhat guarded, but after the second or third interview, we started kind of developing this rapport. And he said, when you're done with this, I'd like to see what you put together. So I actually presented this in his business office in Farmington to him. And it's one of those situations where as you're presenting this, you see wheels turning. And when it was done, and again, he's up there in age, he just kind of leans back like this and does this. And I'm waiting to hear what he's going to say or how he's going to critique my presentation. He goes, that happened back in 1950. And the very next day, my life just went on. I really didn't give it much thought. He goes, when you said you were going to research this, I had no idea the depth of research that you're going to do. He goes, after all these decades, you've got me rethinking this whole thing now. So after all these years of having just put it behind him, it really sparked and kindled his interest, which made me feel good. I mean, if I can do that with an eyewitness, I think that's pretty impressive. So the story was not only picked up in New Mexico and Farmington, but as you can see, it was in the Lubbock Morning Avalanche as well. This time they spelled hundreds correctly. Hundreds in New Mexico report mass flight of strange objects. So the news did travel. It actually made headlines across the country. And I went through an extensive search on online newspaper archives as well as microfilm and gathering some of these. Now, this is particularly interesting. Now, again, Saturday, March 18th, the date that the big newspaper ran in Farmington. Here we have Farmington, and here's the Four Corners region. Clear on the other side of the state over here in Tucumcari, we have a report, Tucumcari 2, and it states that 2 men saw an unidentified object at 9:15 Friday morning, shortly before the saucers were first sighted in Farmington. They were working on the Hudson Canal. The gentleman's name, Gutierrez and Dominguez, said the object, they wouldn't hazard a guess to its identity, circled to the right and at times stood still, then took off, and I think this is important, against the wind in a great burst of speed. So once we get into the government explanation, I think, things like this we need to take into account. But just keep that in mind. So Farmington and clear on the other side of the state at the same time, roughly, we have objects being seen. Now, the Portales, New Mexico Daily News, they ran this story. Sightings occurred on Friday, March 17th, the big day in Farmington as well. And in this particular instance, they state reports were coming into the Tucumcari Daily News from all sections. Richard Everett, editor of the Daily News, said all of the descriptions were of saucer-like discs. Again, while this is transpiring in Farmington, this is going on. He said one report had a red object among the group of saucers, and then it states that the objects were playing tag in the sky and turning sideways, clearly showing that they were saucer-like discs. So we have these repeated narratives playing out. So I ask you, what is the deal with this red object that keeps popping up in these reports? We have Eunice, we have Tucumcari, we have Farmington. So just something to consider. Now, as far as official documentation, we're going to talk about the government and their investigations and their files. I found this Air Intelligence report going through Project Blue Book files. It relays the sighting on March 17th, again the big day, that Friday, where UFOs were being seen. Silver dark objects were reported, estimated 10 to 12,000 feet altitude. They were observed by 3 tech sergeants and a captain standing on the tarmac at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So Tucumcari, Albuquerque, Farmington, we have all of these sightings transpiring at the same time, roughly speaking. And notice here, balloon, a little reference to balloon. The United States Air Force's worst enemy, the dreaded balloon. How many times have we heard that used for explanations? So, but we're going to talk about that. Oh, there we go. So real quick, I'm going to drill through this real quick because we have a lot of information to go over. I want to give you a composite timeline based on all of the information that I have, just to give you an idea of the complexity of this case. March 15th, 11 a.m. to 12 noon, first wave of sightings occurred over Farmington, 6 to 20 objects which moved east to west. Mr. Marlow Webb, who we heard from, was one of the witnesses to this event. March 16th, 10 a.m. to 10:30 was a first wave of UFOs, multiple UFOs sighted by citizens. 11 a.m. to 11:05, a second wave, estimated 15 objects. This is all based on investigator notes, newspaper articles. March 17th, the big day, obviously. Early morning, sighting of a solitary saucer-shaped object was reported by a housewife. 9:15, Tucumcari, New Mexico, we had the flyover of the solitary object witnessed by the 2 individuals we just mentioned. 9:15 to 9:25, 5 to 9 saucers observed, departed to the northeast with others reported 45 minutes later west of town. 10 a.m., hundreds of objects seen west of town. 10:30, red object observed. There's the red object again. 10:30, 2 revolving discs seen in the southeast having a tussle in the sky. Okay, revolving disc seen at roughly 10:30, swooping and swerving, turning like a top. 10:35, 3 objects stage a dogfight, that's a quote, in the sky. 11 o'clock, 2 metallic UFOs seen, smaller UFO moving very fast south to north, larger one was stationary. Again, if these are just debris or objects blowing in the wind, how does that happen, I ask you? So, isn't that interesting? Then we have here, 11:15 to 11:30, swarms of hundreds of objects observed, red objects seen again in the middle of these silver objects, departed to the northeast. 2 o'clock, we have a silvery object shaped like a rectangle with rounded ends that was reported moving in a westerly direction. And then at 3 p.m., again, fleet of hundreds of UFOs being observed in the sky, flying in formation from northeast heading to the southwest. 3 to 3:15, the Kirtland Air Force Base sighting by military personnel. Las Vegas, New Mexico, there was a flyover of objects in the afternoon. No time was given in the article. And then Tucumcari, flyover of multiple objects as mentioned by Richard Everett, the editor, with that red object that was with the formation. So I just want to kind of paint that picture to give you an idea of how complex all of this was. So now we get to the comedy relief portion of our presentation. What's the official explanation with regard to this? Hold on to your hats, folks. I like to call this Debunking the Debunkers, and that's not my title. Mike Kelly, director of the Southwest Special Collections Group at UNM Library, who assisted me with this research, he came up with this. He goes, so this is like Debunking the Debunkers, and I said, I'm going to use that. So I thought that was a good little title. Now, remember that air intelligence report that I showed you that referenced sightings that were being observed by military personnel? Here's the official tally of UFO sightings when you go into the Project Blue Book / Grudge files. If we look here, March 1950, on the left-hand side, you can see the dates. Remember, we're looking at what? March 15th, 16th, and 17th. Where's Farmington referenced? It's not. Hundreds of objects seen in broad daylight by thousands of eyewitnesses, and it doesn't appear on the tally sheet in Project Blue Book. For those that know Blue Book and know what it was really set up to do, that should be no surprise. But as Forrest referenced in his introduction, I like to really do a deep dive. I went beyond this. I started going through the miscellaneous documents, Air Force Office of Special Investigation, for example. And in this case, I found this report. This was a spot intelligence report, and it pertained to sightings in Farmington on March 16th, day number 2. Now, remember the date March 16th, because as we get into the government explanation, I think someone forgot to tell them about this report that was circulating in the files. In this particular instance, it references 2 witnesses on March 16th that saw flying discs which were spherical and oblong in shape and aluminum in color. And it goes on to state that it was around 11 o'clock in the morning and they observed these objects in the sky. So, Project Blue Book. In the files, you'll find a reference to Farmington, although not in the official tally, and it's a reference from Donald Menzel's book, The World of Flying Saucers, which was one of the arch-skeptical books being published at the time. Menzel had a scientific explanation for everything. Nothing to UFOs, nothing to see here, folks, move on. But it's interesting because the book was published in '63, so at some point later after the sightings, this was inserted into the file. Now, Dr. Menzel, in his infinite wisdom, insinuates the sightings only occurred on one day, March 17th, which happened to be St. Patrick's Day. You can get the implication of that. You can get the subtext. And if it was one day, okay, I might be willing to concede that yes, that might be part of it. But he explained it also as a skyhook balloon that was launched from Holloman Air Force Base, ascended to a very high altitude as it drifted over Farmington, and at 60,000 feet, it ruptured. And what witnesses simply observed were little bits of plastic flittering in the sun, blowing in the wind. Hey, I'm just reporting what's listed there. But as we go through this, and there's a little skyhook balloon right there, a rather large skyhook balloon, but there's some problems with the so-called explanation. First, if this was true, it does not account for the 2 previous days of sightings. And remember, we have that air intelligence report referencing March 16th. There were sightings in March 16th, not just the 17th. Second, Dr. James McDonald, who we're going to talk about and pay tribute to momentarily, years later, he was going through the records and found no record of a balloon launch around that time frame by Office of Naval Research at Holloman. Third, why don't the dates correspond between that spot intelligence report, as I mentioned? Did they forget it was only supposed to be a one-day affair? Oops, we have this inconvenient document referencing March 16th. So, sorry, Don, I don't completely agree with your explanation. But unfortunately, the explanation perpetuated. Edward Ruppelt agreed with Dr. Menzel's explanation in his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which is a great classic for anyone that's read that. If you haven't, please pick it up. It's a really good insight into the golden era of ufology. But he agreed with Menzel's theory that it was probably a skyhook balloon that ruptured and people saw bits and fragments. He did make passing reference to the fact that it was not a one-day affair. He didn't allude to the fact that it was just on St. Patrick's Day, but stated that the incident was more than likely caused by a high-altitude balloon that ruptured. So, again, let's look at Menzel's amazing balloon fragments for a second. Let's track this on a map. So we have Farmington up here, we have Santa Fe, Las Vegas, New Mexico, Albuquerque, and Tucumcari. Okay? So 9:15 a.m. and late afternoon, we had sightings in Tucumcari, including the red object. 10 o'clock to 11 a.m., we have sightings over Farmington. 11:15 to 11:30, 2 p.m., 3 p.m., then way down here at the same time, 3 p.m. to 3:15, we have objects in Albuquerque moving in this direction. And then later in the day, maybe the same objects, we can't be for certain, we had objects reported over Las Vegas, New Mexico. And isn't it interesting, right here in the middle of all this, Los Alamos National Laboratories, where the hydrogen bomb was being developed and many other compartmentalized projects. But if this was a ruptured balloon, it sure covered the state in a really good fashion. That's one heck of a balloon. So, but again, let's do something that no one else has done before. Let's look at that theory. I'm willing to poke holes on the balloon theory, no pun intended, but what I'd like to do is have something that we can put to the data. So Marlow Webb on day 1, March 15th, observed UFOs between 11 a.m. and 12 noon. UFOs reportedly flew east to west. If we look at the climactic weather data on that day, we can see here that the wind flow, the historical weather indicates wind speed was 11 to 13 miles per hour. Wind was out of the northwest. So if these are flying east to west, they're almost flying counter to the wind on that particular day. Yet the objects were moving toward the west. So how do we explain that one? Now, on day 2, we didn't have any directional data provided by the witnesses. The second day, the reports are more sketchy. We don't have a lot of definitive detail on that. So we're really unable to correlate wind data with the reports. But on the big day, as you know, we saw the activity. We have lots of data. So 9:15 to 9:25, first cluster of objects departing to the northeast. If we look around 9 o'clock, winds were calm. No discernible wind. So what was blowing these objects? 11 a.m., moving very fast south to north, 2 metallic UFOs seen, and again, larger companion hovering. How can, that happen if it's objects blowing in the wind? Again, 11 a.m., winds are calm. 11:15 to 11:30, swarm of hundreds of objects observed that depart to the northeast. Again, we look at that time period, winds were calm. 2 o'clock, silvery object shaped like rectangle moving in a westerly direction, and 2 o'clock, the winds were out of the northwest. So again, almost moving counter to the wind flow for that day at that time. 3 p.m., UFOs coming from the northeast heading southwest. We look here, winds were calm again. So in addition to that, I'd like to try to find the climactic winds aloft data so we can get a better appreciation for what the stratified wind speeds and directions were. I'm still working on that. This is still an investigation that's progressing. But one final comment on Menzel's theory, just based on that preliminary data. The skyhook balloons are held up with helium. In my opinion, Menzel's theory is held up with a bunch of hot air. And we're going to see some of the documentation again to further bolster what I'm arguing. So, again, Los Alamos and Sandia Base. Here we have Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia Base as it looked circa 1950 in Albuquerque. UFO reports and fireballs. Remember at the beginning we talked about the context, that there were green fireballs being sighted and reported by military and civilian eyewitnesses. Very prevalent activity at that time. In addition to going through the Air Force files, I found the spot intelligence report. And as I often say, and researchers that are in the room know this, sometimes it just doesn't come out and say they were UFOs or this was that. It's sometimes a cryptic little sentence here or there that you have to say, wait a minute, what are they referring to? And the point I'm bringing up is this. You can see here a spot intelligence report, April 19th, 1950, so about a month after the Farmington sightings. Unidentified aerial objects were observed over Los Alamos and Sandia Base, New Mexico on February 25th, March 4th, March 22nd, and April 1st, 1950, right in the time period that we're actually talking about. Objects were of the general type of those previously observed in the New Mexico area during the daytime. Now, this is referring to unidentified aerial phenomenon, the green fireballs, which were seen at night. What is this reference to them being similar to objects being seen during the daytime? Remember the tally we looked at for March 1950? There were no references to any of that. So in my estimation, because of the time frame and because they're referencing daytime sightings, they're talking about the events over that 3-day period around Farmington, New Mexico and other locales. Now, another unofficial explanation, Andy Andrews was a state patrolman, and by the way, Marlow Webb, the surviving eyewitness, knew him very well, and he talked to me about him a little bit. He was quoted in the newspaper saying that people were seeing bits of cotton blowing in the wind. Now, in the interview with Dr. James McDonald, he actually stated that it was desert milkweed or silkweed. It wasn't cotton. It was these little tufts of seedlings that blow off of these desert flowers. And he had seen these floating in the air and surmised that's what people were seeing. When questioned by investigators and newspapers, they actually said that multiple witnesses adamantly denied this. And my argument is, if that's the case, then how come they haven't reported this years prior at that same time of year and years after? Why was it only March 1950? So just something to keep in mind with regard to that. Now, a partial explanation, and I just concede that this is a possibility. Some witnesses alluded to the fact that the planet Venus was visible in the sky on that day and at that time. Here's the latitude, longitude. Venus was in the sky during the morning hours into mid-afternoon. Now, I'm not suggesting that this explains the objects traversing the sky, but if witnesses were suddenly, their attention was drawn to the sky and they saw a stationary light or object, it's possible they could have seen this and thought that that was one of the UFOs other people were reporting. I just simply say that, it could explain some of the sightings, but I feel compelled to at least mention that. Now, Dr. Lincoln La Paz, the scientist that was tasked with investigating the green fireballs, what was his attitude regarding these Farmington sightings? He was already actively investigating the green fireball phenomenon. He states here that 95% of flying saucers amount to nothing more than hoax or illusion. But he goes on to state, and I think this is interesting because he was a very skeptical scientist, he said in his opinion, the reported sightings of a mass flight of saucers or strange objects over Farmington recently belong in the, quote, quite serious, unquote, class. So that's coming from a very skeptical scientist. Now, speaking of scientists, one of the greatest contributors to the field of ufology, which you often don't hear about, I mentioned this gentleman to a few individuals last night. They weren't familiar with his work, and I highly encouraged them to look at it and research it, was Dr. James McDonald, atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Dr. McDonald had a campaign to support expanding the serious scientific study of UFOs. He was a pit bull when it came to UFO researchers, especially at that time when the government was really pervasive and pretty much dismissing all of it as hoax or illusion. He lectured extensively to not just general public audiences, but specifically to scientists in the various disciplines at various military bases and development areas. He interviewed over 500 UFO witnesses in the relatively short time frame he investigated. Unfortunately, he died in 1971, and his research, though, luckily, was preserved. And for anyone interested in his life and in his work, Firestorm by Ann Druffel, another veteran UFO researcher, is a great book. It gives you insight not only into the man, but into the UFO field at that time. But he interviewed the Farmington witnesses by phone from roughly 1967 to 1970. Now, James McDonald Archives at the University of Arizona, all of his papers, all of his research notes, all of his audio recordings are preserved for anyone to go there and listen to and read. I was like a kid in the candy store. I had talked to Stan Friedman about my interest in researching this case, and he had recommended to go there. He said, well, Dr. McDonald did some investigation into that. I had never seen his papers. I had never seen any of his information. August 28th, 2015, I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson and was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, these classic cases, I was listening to recordings with the witnesses. I was literally holding the handwritten notes by Dr. McDonald, and it was just kind of it transported me back to that time period when he was doing his investigations. But he had extensive interview notes regarding Farmington, New Mexico. And I'm very happy the University of Arizona Library Special Collections Group were nice enough to allow me to share these with you. But you can see in his own handwritten notes, witness names, descriptions, etc. And in some cases, even showing like little sketches here. Shape of objects, saucers like 2 plates or saucers were horizontal. And this information has tons of detail that we did not get in the newspaper articles from the time. So a lot of this is new information. For example, the floating cotton or debris, these were quotes from interviews he had conducted in the 60s. Witness stated, "Not cotton or paper, something very different," she said of the event. Another witness, "Not cotton," he feels. Yet another one, Andy Andrews came up with a joke. He came up later joking, "There goes 5 or 10 of them at cotton." And it said, witness stated, "Not cotton." He goes, "That big orange one wasn't cotton," he said. Again, referring to that red or reddish orange object that was reported. Now, we get to the red leader. Look at all the testimony based on the red leader. We have the original newspaper that I shared with you earlier referencing the red leader. Dr. McDonald's notes, how many objects did he see? 20 to 30 in a formation, one red one leading them. Following were silver. Not a V formation, but some formation of some kind. Couldn't recall exact positions. Could see at same time as was spiral, one seen a round one, color of a paper bag, brown, circle. Another one, big red orange object. Yet another one, rusty colored disc. I thought that was rather interesting. And again, all of the objects were of a silver color except for the one red saucer, and all except the latter appeared to be at an extremely high altitude. So I thought back to this image. Now I can't speak to the authenticity of this photo. This is one of the famous photos from the 60s taken over Provo, Utah by a commercial pilot. And I just go back to this image because I think maybe that is the color that they were trying to depict. Rusty color red, reddish orange, brown, brownish red. And I just use that as an example to illustrate perhaps that was the color that they were alluding to. Now, this brings us to another interview. Mr. Clayton Boddy was one of the primary witnesses mentioned in the newspaper from the time. He was the office manager of the Farmington Daily Times paper. And I have to say that his son and grandson were very nice to provide me with this photo of him. I had the recording from the James McDonald collection, but I thought it'd be nice to have the voice and the face so you can kind of put all that together. And Clayton Boddy, this is him during World War II, and his wife Kay, he was interviewed by Dr. McDonald by phone. And so we not only have the handwritten notes, we have the audio recordings as well. This was Clayton Boddy later in years with his wife Kay. They lived in Farmington their entire life. And I did a lecture recently in Albuquerque, and his son and grandson were in the audience, which was really nice, and they were able to kind of add to the presentation a little bit. But what I'd like to do is let you hear James McDonald interviewing Clayton because he had some of the best testimony, and you'll hear him reference this red object that was reported.
My name is Professor McDonald with the University of Arizona. I'm calling from Tucson. I'm doing some work currently on the UFO problem, and I'm digging into some of the older cases to try to check back on what was involved in some of them. I'm calling you to ask if you would have a minute to spare a couple of questions about that classic incident in Farmington back in 1950 when a rather large number of objects were seen. Would you be able to spare 10 minutes at the moment? The cotton hypothesis was pretty well brushed aside before the thing was even cold, wasn't it?
Oh, I think so, as well as the burning paper and all the other jazz you hear about.
Yeah. Well, the one that still stands, as far as I can tell, in the Wright-Patterson files, I've been up at Wright-Patterson several times looking into this, is the ruptured balloon idea. I have written to Holloman to try to get actual data on whether there even was a balloon over there, and I'm contacting some balloon people about breakup. But as one of the witnesses, how would you appraise that hypothesis that it was a fragmented balloon?
I would question it. It didn't appear to me to be that at the time, let's say.
They seem to be substantial objects of discernible...
Substantial objects.
So your feeling would be that it wasn't likely to be fragments of plastic.
I don't think it would be likely to be.
Did they move at high angular velocity, or did they flutter down, or what kind of motions were perceptible?
It would appear to me to be fairly high angular, perhaps, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm not enough of science to know.
The objects were not simply coming down.
No.
They were moving across the sky at times.
Yes.
And were they all moving in the same direction?
Yes.
Do you remember what that was?
Yes. let's see, they were moving in the northwest.
Towards or from?
Toward.
Towards the northwest. About how long do you think objects were observable? Was
Oh,
it?
golly, I don't know, 2 or 3 guys and I stepped in and looked at them and said, how about that? We watched them for some time, and then I went on back to the newspaper that they finally went out of sight. I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, I suppose.
In the case of your own observation?
Yes.
And were there others who did observe them later in the day, as far as you know?
I don't know whether later in the day I happened to be with 2 or 3 people when we observed them, and I'm sure their attitude is a little like mine. They kind of shrugged their shoulders and so on, because we weren't sure of it. This happened about, maybe 9 o'clock in the morning.
How many objects were there when you saw them? Do you recall roughly?
Oh, I wouldn't have any idea. I would say it was a group.
Like as many as half a dozen?
Oh, yeah, I think it's more than that.
More than half a dozen. Several dozen? Or what kind of a ballpark guess is involved there?
Oh, I would say between 20 and 30.
30. And were they in that range? Were they in any formation?
Yes, they were.
What kind of formation?
Well, I felt that there was one red one that appeared to be leading them.
Distinctly red.
Others that were following the formation in silver.
And was it a V or what? Line?
No, I don't think it was. Not as I think back and looking at ducks moving south and that kind of thing. I don't think it was in a V formation.
No.
It looked like a group of things in the air with one red leader, as I think back on it.
They then went across the sky to your northwest, passed out of sight, and that terminated the observation for you.
As
Then.
far as I was concerned, I walked back at the office and I said, hey, guess what? I just saw some flying saucers and it reached proportions that I didn't anticipate at that time and all that. But we did call the Pentagon.
From the paper?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And we denied irrevocably. Forget it. Nothing to it. Well, this always rather annoyed me because I felt at least they could do is come out and check. But I assume they denied it from their point of view. They had nothing to do with it, in other words.
Appreciate your comments.
Well, thank you so much for calling.
Okay, night.
Good night.
That's just one segment from a fairly extensive interview that Dr. McDonald did with Clayton. But you heard him reiterate twice about this red leader that seemed to be leading the pack. So I found that to be very interesting. In reference to the skyhook balloon launch that we talked about earlier, this is Dr. James McDonald's own handwriting. January 29, 1968, phoned Dombrowski, which was a gentleman with the Office of Naval Research, from hotel in D.C. He had checked all ONR records and no skyhook flights anywhere in the country on March 17th or March 18th. It goes on to state, nearest flight in time was released from Minnesota and terminated over Michigan. So there you go. There's the explanation to the purported balloon that was flying over Farmington. And he stated at Farmington, the UFOs moved rapidly across the sky, maneuvering irregularly, did not behave at all like plastic fragments. And any Alamogordo skyhook based on wind flow for that day would have gone to Texas, not Farmington. It would have gone the opposite direction. So we now talk about Farmington and Aztec, New Mexico. I want to mention this. For those that are familiar with Aztec, a purported crash of a flying saucer occurred just 2 years prior, March 25th, 1948, in that area. And that's been extensively researched by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. And this book has actually just recently been republished. And wanted to mention that because Scott and I were communicating, and he was nice enough to put me in touch with a gentleman. He said, I understand that you're doing research on Farmington. I know a gentleman that actually saw those objects you might want to talk to. So I took him up on that offer, and we have a new witness, Mr. Virgil Riggs, third grader in Aztec, New Mexico, just up the road, just to the northeast from Farmington. And in March 1950, Mr. Riggs was attending Aztec Elementary School. And I want to mention also in Farmington, the newspaper accounts reference the school children playing on those 3 days, looking up and seeing these UFOs. Mr. Riggs was just up the road, about 10, 15 miles to the northeast, and he was out on the playground with his schoolmates. And he observed on one particular day what looked like a blanket of dots or objects traversing the sky. And we're going to hear his own words here momentarily. But the appearance of the UFOs as they were flew southwest to the northeast in this formation, like you see there. And here's Farmington, here's Aztec, and the southwest to northeast would have put it on a trajectory where they would have went over Farmington and directly over Aztec. And one other thing I like to mention is the fact that this is what Virgil looked like in 1950, just to kind of put us in that context. So there's Mr. Riggs as he looked in 1950. And real quick, I want you to hear a recorded interview, and then I have a special treat I want to share with you.
I didn't see them right away, but I went outside, and all these older kids were outside at recess. They were looking up. They pointed them out to me and said, "Hey, look here what we got." It was pretty interesting. I thought it was just downright cool. You know, I'd never seen anything like that before. I didn't know what they were, but everybody standing around with their mouth open looking up. The first day, we saw maybe 12 or 15 squares, and I say squares because these things were in a very geometric formation, you know, like patches on a quilt. And but you look up at them, and they look like dominoes, you know, like you'd have 9 or 12 of them, and they were just dots. They look like silver shiny dots, and as you look up at them, you'd see maybe 9 or 12 of them in a formation, and there were always extra dots floating around outside the formation. They would fly into the formation, and it looks like they would bump another one out the other side, and it would rattle around and go places and do things and find another formation. And you know, there were more in the formation than there were floating around loose. And it seemed like every time one would go into a formation, another one would have to come out of the formation. That first day there were probably 12 or 15 of them that we were looking at, and then the second day they were horizon to horizon. Yeah, you just couldn't count them all, like in a quilt pattern. And they still had the same thing going on, you know, different dots moving amongst the patterns. If they were moving at all, they were moving from the southwest to the northeast, but they seemed to be fairly stable and very slow moving if they were moving at all. Looking back on my pilot experience, I would say they were airline level. Maybe at that time, airline level would have been above 13,000 feet, 13 to 30,000 feet, somewhere in that area. The first day there were like some high cirrus clouds moving, you know, wind clouds. And then the second day was severe clear. Things stood out like very vividly. And then the third day there were a lot less. I would say there were probably 30 of these squared, and we never saw them again after that.
If they were moving southwest to northeast, and assuming, of course, that they were on a straight line path this entire time, that would have brought them over Farmington, heading over Aztec.
General area, yes.
And so on all three instances, as far as you can recall, they were moving in that same direction, that same trajectory?
Yes, I believe so.
And how many school children, roughly, do you think were out there with you at any given time during recess?
So I would imagine it would have been anywhere between 35 and 40.
Any rough times that you might have seen these objects during those 3 days?
Yeah, I would say morning recess would have been about 9 o'clock, and then we had an hour for lunch.
That'd be at 12 noon?
Yeah, and then again probably 2:30, and then we were out of school by 4.
Do you recall seeing those after school as well, or was it primarily during recess?
I don't recall seeing them after school, although they probably were there. We were standing around outside there looking up, and we all thought it was pretty neat. We didn't know what it was, but it didn't appear to pose any threat to us. I do remember our teacher, our class teacher, was visibly shaken. She was even crying a little bit. I think she didn't know what it was, but she was a little bit afraid. Us guys, you know, a bunch of young boys, you know, we thought, well, this is strange. We were disappointed when they didn't come back.
After 3 days, you were getting used to seeing them up there.
Yeah, we thought it was kind of fun.
So I want to thank Mr. Riggs for that interview. I know I'm going to be pressed for time, and I may have to skip through some subsequent slides, but I want to, share with you in welcoming Mr. Virgil Riggs, who is actually here with us. I thought it would be great to have interviews, but Virgil, you want to come up? Thank you. There we go. So I just wanted to just state that you may have heard Virgil reference the fact that he was a commercial pilot. So just to give you a little bit of his background, and I've been getting to know Virgil over the last year or so, almost a year I guess now, and he's a straight talker. He's going to tell you what he knows. He's going to tell you what he doesn't know, and I thought it was just really good to have recordings, have photographs, but I think it's really nice that Virgil took his time to be here to address this, to I think really convey the sense that this really happened and we really have living witnesses still around that can testify to this. So with that, I'd like Virgil just to say a few words.
Thank you. It's only been 65 years from that photograph till now, and it's been one hell of a trip. The most famous 11 words in the world: I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. I'm retired from the military, and I'm retired from Babcock and Wilcox Corporation. And the other day they sent me a social security check. It scared the hell out of me. I didn't think I'd live long enough to get it. And secondly, I didn't think it'd be here for me. But now I'm 3 times retired and I'm living a good life. In March of 1950, when all this happened, we had just moved to the Aztec area, and I was attending grade school there. And I'd just like to say that from the mid-40s until the mid-50s and beyond, the Four Corners area of New Mexico has been a real hotbed of UFO activity. Everybody, the kids at school, would come in and get off the bus and compare the UFO activity of the night before. Hey, guess what I saw at Blanco last night? Other kid would say, well, we were down by Chama, and, well, you should have seen them over by Cuba, man. They were really fantastic. So there's been a tremendous amount of UFO activity. I can honestly say I have had 3 sightings of my own, and I can't wait for the next one. I'm ready to get on. But I'm real pleased to be here. Boy, am I glad to be here. I retired from the military. I spent a long time in Vietnam, a little over 5 years. But I'm real pleased that I was invited to come here and speak. The Ramseys, Scott and Suzanne, have included me in their book about the Aztec incident. It's a very good book. The first one was a very good book. The second one is more complete and better. So by way of commercial advertisement, I'd like to plug that book. I don't make a nickel out of it. I really don't have a whole lot more to add. I'm just amazed at the turnout of, look at all those people out there.
I warned you.
Yeah? Well, this is Dirty Pool. It's Dirty Pool because you showed those 2 pictures.
There's a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, folks.
Again, I want to thank Virgil for being here. The one thing, obviously we're pressed for time. We have some wonderful presentations that we're going to be hearing today. But I just wanted to introduce Virgil, let you hear his recorded testimony. And Virgil will be with me down at my table the entire weekend. So feel free to come up, ask additional questions. He'd love to entertain questions. May not have a lot of answers, right, Virgil? But you'll tell him what you know, what you saw. And but I just really think it's nice that we have him here from a case from 1950. How often can you do something like that? So thank you again, Virgil. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to skip through, like I said, a few of these slides, and I just want to show you some of the anomalous behaviors that were described in James McDonald's interview notes that we didn't hear about in the newspaper. So again, this is new material that you may not have heard before. Johnny Eaton was one of the witnesses, but in the notes he stated that the objects had the ability to hover, move short distances away, and then hover again, which he thought was interesting. He also added the fact that he would see them flat and he would see them as circular, again, as some of the reports alluded to, seeing them from different angles. Another one, Mr. John Burrell, another witness that was not mentioned in the newspapers, but were in James McDonald's notes, he observed one of the objects spiraling down like a coiled spring, and then after that, it would be stationary, and it would hover, and then shoot straight up. So very anomalous, nonlinear movement, not conventional aircraft by any stretch. Another one, the wife of John Burrell, Mrs. John Burrell, saw two UFOs in the southeast that seemed to be repeatedly bumping each other as if fighting. So very unusual behavior, obviously not aircraft. Also, later in the day, she observed via a spotting scope, and this is very interesting because all of the public accounts that we had thus far were supposedly with the naked eye. In this particular instance, she was at the San Juan Auto Parts store where the owner had a spotting scope, and they trained it on one of the objects. And again, this is not the original witness sketch. This is from another UFO case, but she described essentially this object that was cigar-shaped, silver in color, with vertical windows or bands. So this is one of the most detailed descriptions we have on record from the Farmington wave. Again, balloon fragments? I don't think so. And then another one, Mr. Bob Fouts, he saw objects that would move, jump, and suddenly make erratic turns in the air, similar to many other UFO reports we have on file. And then Don Hodgson, this was a very interesting one. He referred to the big red-orange object which shot across the sky. Then he said it was stationary, turned on end, and then shot vertical and disappeared. So again, what are we dealing with this? Very quickly, I'm going to skip through this in the interest of time. We had a southwest wave. Again, we had Farmington up here. We had reports in Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, all the way down into Mexico the same month, the same year. Looking at just some of the cities where reports were pouring in the newspapers from the time. Well-documented reports, I might add. In fact, Mexican flying saucers, here Monday, March 8th, before Farmington, 2 more flying discs sighted over Mexico. And it talks about reports over Durango, and it goes on to state that they saw a flying saucer hovering over the city. Then, you see here, it was the 3rd time within a week that strange objects were reported. This is prior to Farmington. Then, Monday, March 13th, this is the same date that we had the Eunice sighting with the red object, which was a prelude to the New Mexico case. We have trained aircraft observers, as it states, confirmed reports of hundreds of persons who said they saw 4 flying saucers yesterday over the city of Mexico City, and one that was reported over Monterrey, Mexico. Again, March 13th, the beginning of the week when all of this transpired. Then we have another one, flying disc filmed over Mexico Field, and I've never been able to find any follow-up to this, but someone actually had a movie camera and filmed these UFOs flying overhead over a Mexico airfield. And it goes on to state it was a shiny object that remained practically motionless over the airport for several minutes. Then it moved to the left, to the right, and I lost sight of it several times, but located it again. And it talks about 16 millimeter film footage being recorded of this incident. This is a fairly dramatic one, and again, if the military is not taking this seriously at the time, then that's really scary, because in this particular instance, you had a recruiting officer at the Dallas Naval Air Station said that he saw a flying disc streak under a B-36 bomber, hover underneath the object, and then suddenly shoot off at a 45-degree angle at high speed. And so that was a very interesting one reported in the Lubbock Morning Avalanche, and that was Thursday, March 16th. Okay, so that was day 2 of the Farmington incident. As it was playing out, this was playing out over Dallas. And again, it talks about other incidents occurring, and it says Captain M.A. Nation, commander of the Dallas Naval Air Station, said there were no jet planes in the area during the time when the discs were reported. And it also says that they had no observation balloons in the air at the time. So again, we can rule out the balloons. Another one, flying saucer Mexico wave continues. Look at this banner headline, flying saucer sighted over Brownsville, more in southwest. Just to bolster the argument that there was a lot going on in that region of the United States as well as Mexico. But there were sightings over Brownsville, Texas, where school children and a number of adults pointing up, looking at objects which then disappeared to the south and the southwest. And just backing up here, you can see here, still more saucers. 50 persons report discs over New Mexico, Cuba, and Mexico. The Cuban incident, by the way, was a commercial airline pilot that saw the UFOs. But despite the prevalence of reports, despite the volume of testimony, we have the prevailing statements by officials. Saucers are imaginary. No, 1,000 times no. As far as the Air Force goes, there's no such thing as a flying saucer. Well, someone needs to tell the flying saucers that, because people were continuing to report them. And again, this is one that really irritates me, especially when you talk to individuals like Mr. Riggs. U.S. military men dismiss subject as so much moonshine. It's an insult to these people. It's an insult to their intellect. Now, real quick, and I've got to move quickly. I'm going to have to skip through a lot of slides. I'm sorry, but we can talk about this over the weekend. Photographic evidence. All these sightings, did anyone take a photograph? There's one picture that was posted by Open Minds back on October 11th, 2013, that alludes to the fact that perhaps this could be a photograph of the UFOs over Farmington. And again, I apologize, I'm going to have to move very quickly. This was from the files of Wendell Stevens, who, as many of you know that have attended the conference, was a regular speaker here each and every year. And he had an extensive UFO photographic collection, which is now in the possession of Open Minds. And I'm very happy to say that they're very forthright in sharing their information, and Alejandro Rojas sent me a scan of the photo, both front and back. And the story that was relayed to Wendell, how he obtained this photo, an individual sold him the photograph, and this is all documented in this documentary VHS tape. He states that the gentleman that sold him the photograph stated that he was in Farmington on business, and after the incident, the government officials swept in, threatened and swore everyone to secrecy, confiscated all the photos, but one escaped and went up to Durango, Colorado, where the Durango newspaper ran the photo. Well, I've gone through the digital online archives. One of the things, as I mentioned, this is an ongoing investigation. I'll be heading up in the next month or so up to Durango. I'm going to go through the microfilm for the subsequent 6 months after this incident to see if that's true. Because all of the other newspaper archives I've gone through online and at UNM, University of New Mexico, I can't find any reference to this photo. And so that's the story as it was told to Wendell, and I believe, he felt that was the truth, but I think you'll find that there's a few holes in that story. And you're going to see what my take is on this photo after we quickly run through this. So again, I want to thank Alejandro Rojas for providing the photo that they have in their possession. And real quick, you can see the date and the writing here, March 17th, it looks like 17th, and they put 18th, 1950, Farmington, New Mexico. But real quick, just want to take a look at a couple things with that. Recently, I obtained, back in July 2015, an original 8x10 newswire photo from a London news agency that had been filed away. This is an uncropped photo. And when you do a negative image of this, you can actually see that there are other objects in this photo. Not just these primary objects, but there are other objects that are circular. I have the original photo downstairs, so if you get the opportunity, please come by and you can take a look at that. But looking at this photo, here's Wendell Stevens' photo. Here's mine. Clearly, that's a cropped photo of the much larger photograph here. But here's the news teletype on the back of my photo, which you can see downstairs, and it states, claimed to be the first sensational picture of the mysterious objects popularly known as flying saucers. This photograph is reproduced from this week's issue of the Teenage Times, a weekly newspaper published in Dublin, Ireland, Farmington, New Mexico. There's a little bit of geography between there. And again, I couldn't find any other American newspapers from the time, and I did an exhaustive study trying to find references to this, but it goes on describing the photo in detail. But The only reference historically I could find to this was in French researcher Amy Michel's book, The Truth of Flying Saucers. And here you see the photograph, the cropped photo that Wendell Stevens had. That was published in this book. Many of you may have this on your bookshelves. But when you look at this, here's the photo from Amy Michel's book. Here is Wendell Stevens, and you can see this little white blemish right here. It's in both photos. What I believe is the man that sold Wendell the photo possibly took the photo out of a book, which used to be, you know, back in the days, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember this, when you did slide presentations before PowerPoint, you'd sometimes just take a photo out of a book so you can incorporate it into a lecture. But if you notice it has that same blemish, when we compare my photo, there's no blemish. In addition, we have this other information back here, which is going to come into play when we analyze this photo. So, real quick, on the back of the photo that Open Minds has, you see the writing on there, but if you do contrast enhancement, you have this paper manufactured by Kodak. In my research, this was commonly used during the 1970s and 80s. So clearly this is an older copy of a much older photograph. Now, in the photograph that I have, it's clearly a vintage copy. It has the date stamped on the back, it has the old news teletype, it has all the hallmarks of a vintage photo. And again, I have it downstairs for those that would like to see it. These are some of the stamps that are on the back that you can see. So, questions remain. Why are there no photos published in the Farmington Daily Times? They published the story. You think they would do a subsequent follow-up article with the photo. Why isn't the photo published in any American newspapers that I've gone through? No reference to it. Why does Amy Michel reference this as another American photograph of flying saucers? And why has it only been purportedly published in an obscure Irish newspaper, which I found out was only published for 1 year? It took me about 8 months to track this newspaper down. But questions remain. Who took the photo? Where did they take it? And is it even genuine? Could be a hoax. I don't know. I'm not a photographic expert, but if there are any in the room, I'd love to let you have your best efforts in trying to analyze it. But I want to point something out. For weeks, I was focused on the objects, straining my eyes, had my cheaters on, my magnifying glass, looking at these objects in the foreground as well as what apparently are in the background here. But something that we need to take into account are the clouds. Let's look at the background. What's going on with that? These appear to be cumulus clouds, not cirrus clouds. Cirrus clouds were repeatedly described, and for those that are in New Mexico, that's typically what we have. Cirrus clouds were reported over Farmington on March 17th, 1950, according to the Denver Post article dated March 18th. In addition, investigators' notes stated, New Mexico, clear, light cirrus clouds at 20,000 feet, weather, no strong winds. And just for comparison, here's what cirrus clouds look like compared to these big fluffy clouds that we see in the background. So the clouds don't match March 1950 for that time period we're looking at. So we need to call that into question. But could this actually be a photo from Farmington? Objects are in an echelon formation. They were described as being in a formation. Object on left is larger than the others, as the leader was described. Now that's assuming this is an echelon formation and the objects are going from right to left. And then the object on the left could be considered the leader, assuming the direction of movement. The object on the left could be red in color, but it's black and white photo. It's very hard to discern, obviously. But this is what's interesting. One eyewitness, a naval veteran and private pilot, described the Farmington UFO spectacle as an object appearing to be red, was in the center of the formation, surrounded by silvery discs. But he goes on to add, they were perfect replicas of a dinner plate, even down to the bottom ring. And do you see this right here? You have the saucer and what appears to be a bottom ring. And 6 other witnesses observed this. So isn't that interesting? So there's information that suggests it might be, information suggests it might not. But this leads us to the Teenage Times, that obscure newspaper in Dublin, Ireland. And this is where I ran into a brick wall. Could not find any reference to it. None whatsoever. Going through archives, newspaper archives. Long story short, I finally wound up going to the National Library of Ireland online and going through their online inventory. And I just have to show you pictures of this place. Isn't this incredible? As a book nut, as a bibliophile, I just love that picture. But I found that they actually had, from November 49 to April 1950, the Teenage Times. So I contacted them, requested a digital copy. They only had hard copy, so I had to request to get digital copies of it. And so here, for the first time at a conference, we're looking at the Teenage Times with the purported photo, the original article, okay? But when I received this, I was so excited, I looked at it, and it was familiar, yet different. And I couldn't put my finger on it at first. And let's take a look at this in detail. Here's an enlargement of the photo in the article. Okay? Now, there's evidence of more than one photo because when we do a side-by-side comparison, and I'm just highlighting the clouds and the objects to give you a little bit more clarity, here's the cloud formation. Do you see this? Little hole here, little hole here. We have this little peninsula, if you will, sticking up here. The objects are different. It looks like this was a series of photos as the objects were moving or the clouds were moving and two photos were taken. Do you see the difference there? And the objects appear, and we'll do a little superimposing of the images here. Here we go. For some reason, there's my red dots. They were a little delayed there. So here's the objects, but now let's superimpose the other photo with the clouds, just to where you can see how they match up here. See that? So the objects shifted up and to the left. So what we have all of these decades thought was one UFO photo, there were actually two. And it actually raises more questions because the photo I have, the news teletype says this photo, as published in the Teenage Times, well, my photo wasn't published in the Teenage Times. It was one of a series, but not the same one. So it shows two sequential UFOs. We know the photo was taken prior to March 24th, 1950, when it was published in the Teenage Times. We still don't know who took the photo, and the objects can only be labeled as unknowns. So that's kind of where we stand. The green fireballs, we talked about that at the beginning, the context. Real quick, before I wrap up, just want to mention that the gist of the findings essentially was negative, and Project Twinkle was eventually disbanded. There have been no indication that even the somewhat strange observations often called green fireballs are anything but natural phenomenon. And Dr. Lincoln LaPlace adamantly denied that. New Mexico Savant says fireballs, not meteors, as reported in the Albuquerque newspaper. So my conclusions, highly anomalous objects were seen in Farmington, New Mexico. Conventional explanations don't fit all of the facts in this particular instance. Objects clearly demonstrated powered flight and intelligent maneuvering. High altitude objects and low altitude objects were being observed simultaneously. And the purported photograph may show the same or similar objects as reported over Farmington, but evidence suggests the photo originated elsewhere, and I'm still pursuing that to get more information. But what occurred over Farmington was just part of an overall UFO wave of activity at the time, and the origin of and nature of the flying saucers to this day is still unknown. Now, real quick, before I sum up, I want to give a special shout out to Mr. Mike Kelly, director of the UNM, University of New Mexico Center for Southwest Special Collections. And this was alluded to by Jerry Blackburn at the beginning, and I wanted to just kind of wrap it up by going back to this real quick. He's in charge of the Special Collections Group at Zimmerman Library, and just to give you a little sample, this is just some of the items. I apologize, my laptop's suddenly running slow for some reason. There we go. So this is just some of the information I have, but I also have Lou Farrish's UFO library incorporated into that. Lou was a staunch collector, avid researcher, voracious reader, mind like an encyclopedia, like Jerry mentioned. This is Lou and I looking at a historic newspaper collection that I brought down for one of the conferences back roughly circa 2006 rather. And all of this material I would like to have preserved, so I approached the University of New Mexico. They came over, saw my extensive library, found merit in it, and as a result, I've entered into a legal contract with UNM. They are interested in this material. They want to preserve it, and they told me, we'll take it on one condition. When we take material, we preserve it for perpetuity. That's what I want. I want that material to be here 50 years, 100 years from now. And let's just use today's discussion, today's research as an example. If the University of Arizona did not preserve James McDonald's research, half of the material we talked about today we wouldn't know about. We have to preserve this material. We have to preserve these case files. We may not have the answer to this mystery in our lifetime, but let's get the information and have it there for future generations of researchers. I don't have any answers. I'm going to strive for answers, and I hope people 50 years, 100 years from now will continue to strive for answers. But with that, I want to thank you. Lots of additional material I couldn't get into, but I'm really under the gun on time. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Mr. Riggs. I want to thank Jerry Blackburn. Thank you again for the award. Very nice. Thank you.